What you just saw was the $200 plate of truffle risotto hitting white linen. It was the third incident that month. 8-year-old Kevin Rupert, the Mafia boss's son, had a reputation. He had reduced battle-hardened bodyguards to helpless bystanders and sent the city's top child psychologists retreating with their hefty fees uncollected. He was a silent storm in designer clothing, a wound no amount of power could heal. The underworld called him the Little Terror. His father, Charles Rupert, was at his breaking point. He had tried everything, except her. A 26-year-old waitress named Helene Murdoch, who worked double shifts to cover her father's medical bills and didn't know the difference between a capo and a consigliera. And she was about to do the one thing no one else dared. She was about to step into the shadow of the Rupert family and offer her warmth. If you're ready to enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us in creating more amazing stories, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's jump right into the story. The St. Regis Grill wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into by accident, but it had its own quiet dignity. Tucked in Manhattan's elite corridor, it served power brokers over dry-aged steaks and senators who preferred their deals medium rare. Helene Murdoch knew every regular by drink preference. At 26, she moved through the space with practiced efficiency that made her nearly invisible. Her mind was always elsewhere, calculating shifts until her father's next treatment, or studying the medical books stacked beside her bed. Helene was a watcher. She noticed the tremor in an elderly woman's hand before she ordered decaf, the exhaustion behind a young father's smile. Her life was a study in quiet survival, 2 jobs, mounting hospital debt, a barely affordable studio. She was tired, but she wasn't defeated. The name Charles Rupert she knew only from whispered conversations and the sudden kitchen tension when his reservation appeared. He was the ghost king of the underworld, controlling entire boroughs with a glance. He was also a widower, his wife dead 8 months in a suspicious accident. But Kevin Rupert's name was infamous among private staffing agencies. The boy was a legend. Removed from collegiate school after a 40-minute silent breakdown. 6 resigned nannies in 3 months, including a psychiatric nurse. He was 8 years old with more psychological standoffs than combat veterans. Helene knew this because Mrs. Chun, who managed elite placements, would sit at the bar venting about the impossible Rupert case. The boy doesn't speak, Helene. He just destroys. His father offers any price. No one will take it anymore. It was a cold Thursday evening when the door opened and the entire room inhaled. A man in charcoal stepped inside, flanked by 2 broad figures. Behind him, a small boy moved like he carried a collapsing star. Charles Rupert looked less like a crime lord and more like a drowning man. The boy, Kevin, was devastatingly different. Neatly combed blonde hair, crisp white shirt, expressionless face, clenched fists. "Table for 2, Charles said quietly. "Of course, sir. Right this way." The moment they sat, the unraveling began. Kevin tipped his water glass sideways. Overturned salt, pepper, sugar onto his father's plate. Methodical, mechanical, blank-faced. Then it happened. Kevin picked up the $200 risotto plate and shoved it forward with both hands. It crashed to the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The boy's face crumpled. His shoulders shook. He wasn't throwing a tantrum. He was breaking. Silently, devastatingly breaking. Charles Rupert, the man who commanded fear with a whisper, sat frozen. Everyone in the room stepped back. The manager retreated. Even his men stayed rooted, expressions neutral. Everyone backed away. Then Helene Murdoch walked forward. Charles had chosen Thursday evening deliberately. Fewer diners. Less attention. Less chance of witnesses to whatever might unfold. He'd canceled 3 previous reservations when his instincts told him Kevin wasn't ready. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like maybe, just maybe, they could sit together like a normal father and son and pretend the world hadn't shattered 8 months ago. He was wrong. Helene led them to the corner booth, the one surrounded by shadows and distance. Charles thanked her with a nod that carried the weight of a man who knew courtesy was all he had left. Kevin slid into the booth without looking at anything, his small hands immediately finding the edge of a tablecloth, fingers curling and uncurling in a rhythm only he understood. Charles watched his son the way a soldier watches an unexploded device. Carefully, constantly, helplessly. "They have that pasta you liked last time," Charles offered quietly, his voice stripped of all the authority that made grown men confess to crimes they didn't commit. "The one with the butter sauce." Kevin said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the white orchids in the center vase, but he wasn't really seeing them. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere Charles couldn't follow, no matter how much power he wielded in the world outside this booth. The water came first. Kevin stared at his glass for a long moment, then tipped it sideways with 2 fingers. The liquid spread across the white linen in a slow, deliberate pool. Charles didn't react. He'd learned that reactions only fed the fire. He simply moved his own glass aside and waited. The salt shaker came next. Kevin picked it up with both hands and overturned it onto his father's empty plate. Then the pepper. Then the sugar caddy, watching the white crystals scatter like snow across the wreckage of what was supposed to be a quiet dinner. "Kevin," Charles said, but the word had no strength behind it. It was barely a whisper. A plea dressed as a name. The boy's jaw tightened. His breathing grew shallow. Helene approached with menus, and Charles caught the flicker of concern in her eyes before she professionally masked it. She'd seen enough troubled families in this restaurant to recognize the signs. But this wasn't a custody dispute or a business partnership dissolving over appetizers. This was something darker. Something that lived in the space where words used to be. When the risotto arrived, golden saffron rice crowned with shaved truffles, the kind of dish that cost more than some people's weekly rent, Charles felt his chest tighten. Kevin stared at the plate with an expression that could have been hunger or hatred or both. His small hands gripped the edge of the white porcelain, knuckles going pale. "Son, please," Charles whispered, and the word please coming from his mouth felt like a surrender. Kevin shoved the plate forward with both hands. The ceramic slid across the tablecloth, spilling rice and cream in a cascading wave before tilting off the edge and exploding against the hardwood floor. The sound was catastrophic in the hushed dining room, sharp, final, unforgiving. And then Kevin's face crumpled like paper in a fist. The boy wasn't just crying. He was breaking down. His small shoulders convulsed with silent sobs that shook his entire body. Tears streamed down his face, but no sound escaped his throat, as if his grief had grown too large for voice, too heavy for language. His hands covered his face, and his whole body folded inward, collapsing into itself the way buildings do when the foundation finally gives out. Charles reached for him instinctively, but his hands stopped midair, hovering uselessly in the space between them. He didn't know how to touch his son anymore. Didn't know if touch would help or hurt or make everything infinitely worse. His power meant nothing here. His reputation was worthless. The man who controlled the city's underworld with a glance couldn't even calm his own child. Not even the toughest men in the underworld could help him. His bodyguards stood frozen near the entrance, their expressions carefully blank, understanding that this was a battle their boss had to fight alone, and was losing. The entire dining room held its breath. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the kitchen noise seemed to fade, as if the whole world had paused to witness this powerful man's complete and utter helplessness before his 8-year-old son's grief. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the comfortable quiet of a refined dining room, but something heavier, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes breathing feel like a choice you have to consciously make. Everyone in the room froze, their eyes locked on the corner booth where the most dangerous man in New York sat utterly defeated beside his sobbing child. A silver-haired businessman at table 6 had his water glass suspended in midair, forgotten. The young couple near the window stopped pretending to look at their menus. Even the elderly woman who'd been complaining about her salmon going cold suddenly found her complaint monumentally unimportant. They all knew who Charles Rupert was, or if they didn't know his name, they knew his presence, the way animals know a predator has entered their territory. But this wasn't the predator they'd expected. This was something far more dangerous to witness, A powerful man stripped of all armor, vulnerable in a way that made everyone uncomfortable because it reminded them that power was an illusion, that control was temporary, that we're all just one moment away from breaking. Near the entrance, Charles's two bodyguards remained perfectly still, their broad shoulders blocking the doorway like living barriers. Marco, the taller one with a scar across his jaw, kept his eyes fixed on the wall above the booth, refusing to look directly at his boss's distress. Beside him, Vincent's hand twitched toward his phone, an instinct to fix, to call someone, to do something, but he stopped himself. They both understood with absolute clarity that this was not a problem violence could solve, not a situation intimidation could control. This was private grief made public, and even men trained to eliminate threats knew there was no weapon effective against a father's helplessness. In the kitchen, visible through the service window, the staff had gone completely silent. The head chef held a sauté pan frozen over the flame. Two line cooks stood with their hands hovering over cutting boards, knives abandoned. They'd all heard the crash. They'd all seen enough through the window to understand what was happening. And they all knew the unspoken rule of high-end service. When powerful people break down, you become invisible. The restaurant manager, Richard, stood behind the host stand with his hand pressed against his chest, as if physically holding his heart in place. His face had gone pale. In 20 years of managing elite establishments, he'd witnessed affairs, business deals, marriage proposals, and countless displays of wealth and status. But he'd never seen this raw, unfiltered parental devastation in his dining room, and from a man whose reputation preceded him like a thunderstorm. Richard caught the eye of Jennifer, the senior server working the adjacent section. She was already backing away from her table of lawyers, her tray of drinks forgotten. Her expression asked the question everyone was thinking. Do we intervene? Do we clear the room? Do we call someone? But who do you call when the person who needs help is the man everyone else calls when they need help? Helene stood at the service station, a clean napkin in one hand, a glass of water in the other. Her colleagues were retreating, creating distance between themselves and the catastrophe unfolding in the corner booth. The busboy who normally cleared that section had disappeared entirely into the kitchen. Another server had suddenly found urgent business in the supply closet. The unspoken message was clear. Stay away. Don't get involved. Don't make eye contact. Don't become part of whatever this is. This man could ruin careers with a phone call, destroy reputations with a word. His grief was not something you approached, it was something you survived by being smart enough to look away. But Helene wasn't looking away. She was watching Charles Rupert's shaking hands, Kevin silent, body-racking sobs, and the ocean of broken ceramic and spilled risotto spreading across the floor. She was watching a child drown in pain while an entire room of adults chose safety over compassion. And something in her chest, something stubborn and foolish and achingly human, refused to let her turn away. Everyone backed away. Then she walked forward. The moment Helene took her first step toward the corner booth, Jennifer grabbed her wrist. The senior server's grip was tight, urgent, her eyes wide with warning. Don't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Helene, don't. You don't know what you're doing. But Helene gently pulled her arm free, her expression calm in a way that made Jennifer's panic seem almost irrational. I know exactly what I'm doing, Helene said quietly. She picked up a clean cloth napkin from the service station, folded it once with practiced efficiency, and reached for a glass of water with her other hand. He could destroy you, Jennifer hissed, still trying to stop her without making a scene. One word from him, and you'll never work in the city again. Please, just let Richard handle it. Helene glanced back at Richard, who stood frozen behind the host's stand like a statue of indecision. She looked at the kitchen staff, still paralyzed behind the service window. She looked at the bodyguards near the entrance, who'd been trained to eliminate threats but had no protocol for this. Then she looked back at the corner booth, where an 8-year-old boy was collapsing under the weight of grief no child should carry. No one's handling it, Helene said simply. That's the problem. She moved through the dining room with the same quiet efficiency she brought to every shift, weaving between tables with the napkin and water glass balanced perfectly in her hands. But there was something different now, a deliberate quality to her steps, as if she'd made a choice that went beyond professional courtesy, beyond simple kindness. This was a decision that required her to override every survival instinct screaming at her to turn around. The other diners watched her progress the way people watch someone walk toward a cliff edge. The elderly woman at table 3 actually gasped softly. The businessman whispered something to his companion that sounded like, "Is she insane?" Near the entrance, Marcos straightened slightly, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket. Vincent put a subtle hand on his arm, shaking his head once. "Let her go. See what happens." They'd been with Charles long enough to recognize when their boss needed protection from external threats and when he needed something they couldn't provide. Helene reached the edge of the catastrophe. Broken ceramic littered the floor in a constellation of white shards. Golden risotto had splattered across the dark hardwood, the truffle oil creating small rainbows in the overhead light. Kevin's small body was still convulsing with silent sobs, his face buried in his hands, his entire world reduced to whatever unbearable pain lived behind his closed eyes. Charles sat perfectly still, his hands still hovering uselessly in the air, his powerful frame radiating a helplessness that seemed to physically hurt him. His jaw was clenched, so tight Helene could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. His eyes, those famous, intimidating eyes that made hardened criminals confess, were red-rimmed and glistening. She stopped at the edge of the booth. Not too close. Not invading. Just present. Charles's gaze snapped up to her, and for a moment, Helene saw what everyone else saw. The dangerous man, the feared boss, the person you didn't approach without permission. His expression was a warning wrapped in exhaustion. Back away. This is not your problem. You don't want to be part of this. But Helene didn't back away. Instead, she held his gaze steadily, her brown eyes meeting his without flinching, without apology, without the fear he was accustomed to seeing. There was something in her expression that wasn't challenge or defiance. It was understanding. It was the look of someone who'd sat beside hospital beds and held hands through impossible pain. It was the look of someone who knew grief intimately and wasn't afraid to stand in its presence. She wasn't looking at the Mafia boss. She was looking at a father who was drowning. And her expression said, quietly but clearly, "I see him. I see the boy. And I'm not leaving." Charles's breath caught. No one had looked at him like that in 8 months. No one had seen past the power to the person underneath. And certainly no one had ever dared to step into his family's pain uninvited and offer something as simple and revolutionary as presence. Helene lowered herself to one knee, ignoring the risotto soaking into her uniform, ignoring the broken ceramic that pressed against her shin, ignoring everything except the small boy whose entire world was collapsing in on itself. She placed the water glass on the edge of the table within Kevin's reach, then set the folded napkin beside it with the same careful precision she brought to every task. She didn't try to stop his crying. Didn't tell him everything would be okay. Didn't offer any of the empty reassurances adults give children when they don't know what else to say. Instead, she simply waited, her presence steady and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world to sit beside this broken boy in his broken moment. Kevin's sobs continued, his small shoulders heaving with each silent, gasping breath. His hands still covered his face, protecting himself from a world that had taken too much from him too soon. Helene leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper, meant only for him. "It hurts when you're this angry, doesn't it?" The words were simple, direct, honest in a way that cut through all the careful language adults usually wrapped around children's pain. She wasn't asking if he was okay. She wasn't telling him to calm down. She was naming the thing everyone else was too afraid to acknowledge. His anger was grief, and grief hurt like nothing else in the world. Kevin's hands lowered just slightly from his face, his red-rimmed eyes peeking through his fingers, surprised that someone had actually said it out loud. "It's okay to be angry," Helene continued softly, her tone carrying the weight of someone who knew this truth personally. "Sometimes anger is the only thing big enough to hold all that hurt." She reached forward slowly, telegraphing her movement, so he could pull away if he wanted to. Her hand moved toward his, Not to grab, not to restrain, but to offer connection. Her fingers came to rest gently on top of his small, clenched fist, her touch featherlight, asking permission rather than demanding surrender. The moment she touched his hand, the boy fell silent. It wasn't gradual. It was instant, absolute, like someone had flipped a switch inside him. His shoulders stopped shaking. His gasping breaths evened out. The tears still streamed down his face, but the violent sobs that had racked his small body simply stopped. Kevin stared at her hand on his with an expression that was part shock, part confusion, as if he'd forgotten what gentle touch felt like. As if kindness had become a foreign language he no longer understood. His fingers slowly uncurled beneath hers, opening like a flower that had been closed too long. Helene didn't move.
Didn't speak.
She just stayed there, kneeling in the mess, her hand resting on his, offering the one thing no amount of money or power could buy, simple human warmth in the presence of unbearable pain. The dining room remained frozen, every eye locked on the impossible scene unfolding in the corner booth. A simple waitress, kneeling in spilled food and broken dishes, had just accomplished what trained professionals, expensive therapists, and hardened bodyguards had failed to do for 8 months. She had reached Kevin Rupert. Charles sat perfectly still, his hands now lowered to his lap, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. He was watching a miracle happen in real time, and he had no framework to understand it. His entire life had been built on power, control, fear, and respect. He'd learned early that problems could be eliminated, that money could buy solutions, that force could bend the world to your will. But this woman, this ordinary, underpaid waitress who worked double shifts and probably worried about rent, had just demonstrated a power he didn't possess. She'd walked into his son's grief without hesitation, without fear, without any expectation of reward, and offered something his entire empire couldn't provide. Connection. Understanding. Presence. Kevin's eyes slowly lifted from their joined hands to Helene's face, searching for something.
Trust, maybe.
Or permission to feel what he was feeling. Or perhaps just confirmation that she was real, that this moment was real, that someone had finally seen him as more than a problem to be solved. The room remained dead quiet, but now the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of fear or discomfort. It was the silence of witnessing something sacred, something that shouldn't be interrupted even by breathing. The elderly woman at table 3 had tears streaming down her face. The businessman had set down his phone, his expression soft with something that looked like grief for his own children, his own failures at connection. Charles Rupert, the man who controlled entire districts with a whisper, who'd built an empire on fear and loyalty and carefully calibrated violence, sat utterly speechless. He was staring at Helene with an expression that none of his men had ever seen on their boss's face, pure, unguarded shock mixed with something that looked dangerously close to reverence. For the first time in years, the Mafia boss had no words. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but nothing came out. His hands, which had signed death warrants and counted millions in cash and never trembled during negotiations, were shaking visibly against his thighs. He watched his son's small fingers slowly wrap around Helene's hand, clinging to her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to water. Charles had spent 8 months trying everything. He'd hired the best child psychologists money could buy, doctors with offices on Park Avenue and waiting lists 6 months long. He'd brought in specialists from London, from Switzerland, from institutions so exclusive they didn't even advertise their services. He'd offered blank checks, promised favors, called in debts from people who owed him their lives. Nothing had worked. He'd tried being gentle. He'd tried being firm. He'd tried giving Kevin space, and he'd tried hovering close. He'd bought him everything a child could want, toys that cost more than cars, trips to places most people only saw in magazines. He'd canceled meetings, restructured his entire operation, made himself available in ways that would have been unthinkable before his wife died. Nothing had reached his son. And then this woman, this waitress whose name he didn't even know, who wore a uniform with a small coffee stain near the collar, who probably took the subway home and worried about electricity bills, had knelt down and spilled food and broken dishes and done the impossible with nothing more than a gentle touch and a few honest words. His power was useless here. His reputation meant nothing. His feared aura couldn't fix this. For 8 months, Charles had been confronting the single most terrifying truth of his life, that the thing he loved most in the world was something he couldn't control, couldn't protect, couldn't save with all the resources at his disposal. But she could. This simple woman, who lived in a world so far removed from his that they might as well have been on different planets, possessed something he didn't. Something his money couldn't buy. Something his influence couldn't command. Something his carefully constructed empire couldn't manufacture. She had the ability to see pain without fear, to approach suffering without hesitation, to offer comfort without expecting anything in return. Marco and Vincent stood near the entrance, both men's expressions carefully neutral, but Charles knew them well enough to see the shock beneath the professional masks. They'd been with him through wars, through hostile takeovers, through moments when his life hung by a thread. They'd never seen him vulnerable. They'd never seen him helpless. And they'd certainly never seen him rendered completely speechless by a woman who probably earned in a year what he spent on a single dinner. Helene shifted slightly, still kneeling, and used her free hand to pick up the glass of water. She held it toward Kevin, not pushing it on him, just offering. "Small sips," she said gently. "Sometimes water helps." Kevin took the glass with his free hand, his grip still tight on Helene's fingers with the other, as if letting go meant drowning again. He brought the water to his lips and drank, his eyes never leaving her face, studying her like she was a puzzle he desperately needed to solve. Charles watched this exchange, so simple, so ordinary, so impossibly profound, and felt something crack open in his chest. It wasn't just gratitude, though that was part of it. It wasn't just relief, though that flooded through him like a drug. It was the devastating recognition that he'd been wrong about everything. Power wasn't strength. Control wasn't protection. Fear wasn't respect. This was strength. What she was doing right now, kneeling in a mess without hesitation, offering her hand to a child in pain, this was real power. Helene stayed with Kevin until his breathing fully settled, until the tension in his small shoulders finally released, until he'd finished the entire glass of water and set it down with steady hands. Only then did she gently squeeze his fingers once before letting go, and even that separation seemed to take something from him. His eyes widened slightly, a flash of panic crossing his face. "I'm just going to clean up," she said softly, gesturing to the mess around them. "I'm not leaving. I'm right here." Kevin nodded, a tiny movement, but it was the first intentional communication he'd made all evening. Charles noticed. Charles noticed everything about this moment, cataloging it like evidence he'd need to study later to understand how it had happened. Helene stood slowly, her knees protesting the time spent on the hard floor, and retrieved a small bus tub and cleaning supplies from the service station. Jennifer started to approach, to help or maybe to pull Helene away from this dangerous proximity to the Rupert family, but Helene shook her head slightly. This wasn't a job to be shared or delegated. This was care, and care required consistency. She knelt again, this time focused on the practical work of gathering broken ceramic pieces, of scooping risotto back onto serving plates, of wiping golden oil from the dark hardwood. She worked with the same unhurried precision she'd brought to Kevin's emotional crisis, treating the spilled food not as the disaster everyone else saw, but as a symptom of something deeper, something that mattered more than expensive ingredients and shattered dishes. Charles watched her work, still unable to form words. The entire dining room watched. This felt less like a waitress cleaning a mess and more like a ritual, something profound disguised as something ordinary. When she'd gathered the last piece of broken plate, the last grain of rice, Helene stood and met Charles's eyes. He looked like a man who'd witnessed a resurrection, his expression raw with emotions he clearly didn't know how to process. "Thank you," he finally managed, and his voice, that voice that commanded obedience from dangerous men, that closed million-dollar deals, that could threaten without raising volume, was shockingly soft, almost broken. I can't." He stopped, shaking his head, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a wallet made of leather that probably cost more than Helene's monthly rent and withdrew a stack of bills so thick it made her stomach drop. Hundreds. Multiple hundreds. He set them on the table, not counting, not caring about the amount. "This is too much," Helene said quietly, her eyes on the cash that could pay her father's next 3 treatments. "It's not enough," Charles replied, his voice still carrying that strange softness. "It will never be enough for what you just did." He looked at her directly, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, his eyes held something other than exhaustion or fear. They held respect. Deep, genuine respect that had nothing to do with hierarchy or power. "What's your name?" he asked. "Helene. Helene Murdoch." "Helene," he repeated, as if testing the weight of it, committing it to memory. He stood, his tall frame unfolding with a careful slowness, and extended his hand. She shook it, her small hand disappearing into his much larger one. His grip was gentle, almost reverent. "You will hear from me, Helene Murdoch," he said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a promise. It was a statement of inevitable fact, delivered with the certainty of a man who always followed through. He looked down at Kevin, who was watching Helene with an expression that looked like hope mixed with fear. Hope that this warmth might stay, fear that it might disappear like everything else good in his life. "Say thank you to Miss Murdoch," Charles said softly to his son. Kevin's lips moved. No sound came out, but Helene read the words clearly. "Thank you." She smiled, a genuine warmth that reached her eyes. "You're welcome, Kevin. Any time you need someone to see you, I'm here." Charles's hand tightened briefly on the table's edge, knuckles going white. Then he nodded once, placed a hand on Kevin's shoulder, and guided his son toward the exit. Marco and Vincent fell into step behind them, the protective formation reforming, but all 3 men moved differently now, quieter, more careful, as if they were carrying something precious and fragile. The door closed behind them, and the entire restaurant seemed to exhale as one. If you believe every child's pain deserves to be seen, hit subscribe. Only trolls and those who ignore suffering won't subscribe. Charles sat in his study at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, staring at the folder Marco had delivered 2 hours earlier. The leather chair that usually felt like a throne now felt like a witness stand. Kevin was finally asleep upstairs, the first peaceful sleep in weeks, according to the night nurse, and Charles was alone with the truth about Helene Murdoch. The background check was thorough. Marco didn't do anything halfway. Bank records, employment history, educational background, social media presence, known associates, rental agreements, medical records where legally accessible. Everything that could be found about a person in the digital age was contained in 37 pages of single-spaced text. And it was spotless. Not spotless in the way that suggested someone covering their tracks. Spotless in the way that suggested a person who simply lived a good, honest, unremarkable life. No criminal record. No questionable associations. No sudden unexplained deposits or lifestyle changes that might indicate she was positioning herself for something. Helene Marie Murdoch, age 26. Born in Albany, raised by a single father after her mother died of breast cancer when Helene was 7 years old. Scholarship to SUNY Albany, degree in psychology that she'd never finished because her father had a stroke during her junior year. She'd withdrawn, moved back home, worked 3 jobs to keep him in assisted living until his insurance ran out. Then she'd moved them both to New York 2 years ago when a facility in Queens accepted him on sliding scale payment. She worked the morning shift at St. Regis Grill and the evening shift at a diner in Jackson Heights. Her rent was 2 months overdue. Her student loans were in deferment she'd requested 4 times. Her grocery purchases, tracked through her debit card, averaged $30 a week. She sent her father flowers every Sunday. The same bodega, the same arrangement, paid for in cash she probably couldn't afford. There were no red flags. No hidden agendas. No evidence of someone trying to infiltrate his world or leverage an opportunity. The money he'd left on the table, enough to cover 3 months of her father's care, she'd tried to refuse. Marco's notes at the bottom of the report were characteristically blunt. Subject appears genuine. No indicators of deception or manipulation. Recommend continued observation, but assessment is she's exactly what she appears to be, a good person in a bad situation who did a kind thing because that's who she is. Charles closed the folder and pressed his palms against his eyes. He'd spent 20 years in a world where everyone wanted something, where kindness was a transaction, where nothing was offered without strings attached. He'd built his empire on understanding human motivation, on seeing through lies, on recognizing angles before they were played. And this woman had knelt in spilled food and held his son's hand because it was the right thing to do. Not because she knew who Charles was. Not because she expected payment. Not because she was positioning for future advantage. She'd done it because a child was in pain, and she couldn't walk away from that. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She was rare. Dangerously rare. The kind of genuine human warmth that his world would devour if he didn't protect it. He picked up his phone and called Marco. "I want her protected," Charles said without preamble. Quietly. "She doesn't know about it." No one approaches her. No one threatens her. No one makes her uncomfortable. If she has a problem, rent, medical bills, someone giving her trouble, I want to know about it before she does. Understood, Marco replied. What's the reason? Charles looked at the folder again, at the photo of Helene from her employee badge, tired eyes, gentle smile, completely unaware that she'd just changed everything. She helped my son, Charles said quietly. That means she's family now. She just doesn't know it yet. He ended the call and walked upstairs to Kevin's room. His son was sleeping peacefully, one small hand curled around the cloth napkin Helene had used to wipe his tears. Charles had found it in Kevin's jacket pocket. The boy had taken it, kept it, held onto it like a talisman. Charles stood in the doorway, watching his son breathe easy for the first time in 8 months, and made a decision that had nothing to do with his empire and everything to do with the only thing that truly mattered. He would bring Helene Murdoch into their lives. Not as an employee, not as someone to be controlled or commanded, but as the one thing Kevin desperately needed and Charles couldn't provide on his own, a source of genuine warmth in a world gone cold. He stared at the sleeping child, not with suspicion, but with gratitude for the woman who'd shown him what real strength looked like. 3 days later, Charles Rupert walked back into the St. Regis Grill during the quiet afternoon lull between lunch and dinner service. This time he came alone, no bodyguards, no entourage, no armor of intimidation. Just a man in an expensive suit carrying the weight of a decision that terrified him more than any business deal ever had. Richard, the manager, nearly dropped his clipboard when he recognized him. "Mr. Rupert, we weren't expecting. Shall I prepare a table?" "I'm here to speak with Helene Murdoch," Charles said quietly. "Is she working today?" Richard's eyes widened slightly. Yes, she's in the back, prepping for the dinner shift. I can get her for you."
Please.
Helene emerged from the kitchen 2 minutes later, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression curious, but not fearful. She'd expected this conversation might happen. Men like Charles Rupert didn't say, "You'll hear from me," without following through, but she hadn't expected him to come himself. "Mr. Rupert," she said, her voice steady. "How's Kevin?" The fact that she asked about his son first, before asking why he was there or what he wanted, made Charles's chest tighten. "He's been sleeping better," he admitted. "He kept the napkin you used. Carries it everywhere." Helene smiled softly. "That's good. Connection objects can help. That's actually why I'm here." Charles gestured to an empty booth. "May we sit?" They settled across from each other, and for a moment Charles just studied her. This woman who'd accomplished the impossible with nothing more than compassion and courage. She met his gaze without flinching, without the calculated deference he was used to seeing. "I need your help," Charles said finally, the words foreign in his mouth. Men in his position didn't ask for help. They commanded. They purchased. They demanded. But this required something different. "Kevin needs you." "I'm not a therapist," Helene said carefully. "I know. I've hired 6 therapists. They all failed." Charles leaned forward slightly. "You're not a therapist. You're something better. You see him. You don't try to fix him or analyze him or manage him. You just see him. He pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table between them. I want to hire you as Kevin's companion.
Not a nanny.
Not a servant. Someone who spends time with him. Someone who brings the warmth you showed him that night. Helene opened the envelope and her breath caught. The number on the contract was more than she made in 2 years. Maybe 3. This is too much, she whispered. It's not nearly enough, Charles replied, echoing his words from 3 nights ago. Your father's medical bills will be covered. Your rent paid. Your student loans eliminated. All I'm asking is that you give Kevin what money can't buy, your genuine presence. He watched her carefully, saw the war happening behind her eyes. This was life-changing money. Security she'd never known. Freedom from the crushing weight of debt and worry. I'm not asking you to be bought, Charles said softly, reading her hesitation. I'm asking you to let me remove the obstacles that prevent you from doing what you're clearly meant to do, help children who are hurting. Starting with mine. Helene looked at the contract, then at Charles, then thought about Kevin's small hand gripping hers like she was the only solid thing in a drowning world. I have one condition, she said finally. Charles straightened. Name it. This isn't about the money. If Kevin needs me to walk away, if my presence stops helping him, I leave. No matter what the contract says. His well-being comes first. Always. Charles Rupert, the man who negotiated million-dollar deals and never accepted terms he didn't dictate, nodded without hesitation. Deal, he said, and extended his hand. Helene shook it, sealing an arrangement that had nothing to do with power or control, and everything to do with a child who desperately needed someone to see him. Comment, I stand for genuine connection if you can't stand people who only want money and power. Hit the like button if you know true power comes from the heart, not just fear. Disrespectful people who think they're above others won't click like. 6 months changed everything. The Rupert Estate's sunroom had become Kevin's favorite space, largely because Helene spent her afternoons there with him. Large windows flooded the room with natural light, and she'd quietly transformed it from a formal and used space into something that felt alive. Plants on the windowsills, art supplies scattered across a low table, books stacked in comfortable chaos on the shelves. Charles stood in the doorway, watching them. He did this often now, these silent observations where he cataloged the small miracles happening in his son's life. Kevin sat cross-legged on the floor, colored pencils spread around him like a rainbow explosion, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he drew. Helene sat beside him, not hovering, not directing, just present, reading a book but glancing up every few moments to smile at whatever Kevin was creating. The boy had started speaking again, 3 months ago. Just whispers at first, single words offered like fragile gifts. Now he talked in full sentences, his voice still quiet but growing stronger. He laughed sometimes. Actual laughter that echoed through the house and made Charles's chest ache with relief, so profound it felt like prayer. Done, Kevin announced, holding up his drawing with both hands. Helene set her book aside and leaned in to look. Tell me about it. It's us, Kevin said, pointing to the 3 figures he'd drawn in crayon. That's you, that's me, and that's Dad. The figures stood in front of a house, all holding hands, all smiling. The son he'd drawn in the corner had an actual happy face. I love it, Helene said softly, and Charles could hear the emotion in her voice. You're getting really good at faces. Can we hang it on the fridge?
Kevin asked.
Absolutely. Your dad will want to see this. I'm already seeing it, Charles said from the doorway, and both of them turned to look at him. He walked into the room, moving slowly, carefully, still learning how to exist in this gentler version of his life. He knelt beside Kevin and studied the drawing seriously. This is excellent work, son. Kevin beamed, and Charles felt that now familiar sensation of his world tilting on its axis. His son was healing. Actually healing. The silent terror who'd broken dishes and therapists was becoming a child again, hesitant, sometimes sad, but undeniably present in a way he hadn't been since his mother died. From that moment Helene had knelt in spilled risotto. No one in Charles's organization dared disrespect her. The word had gone out quietly but firmly. Helene Murdoch was untouchable. She was family. She was more valuable than any soldier, any capo, any business associate. Marco and Vincent treated her with a reverence usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. The household staff adored her. And Charles watched her laugh at something Kevin said, watched her ruffle his son's hair with easy affection, and realized he'd been wrong about power his entire life. Real power wasn't fear or control or the ability to make people do what you wanted. Real power was this: a woman who'd chosen compassion over safety, who'd walked toward pain instead of away from it, who'd given his son back his voice simply by listening. "Helene," Charles said quietly, and she looked up at him with those steady brown eyes that had seen through his armor from the very beginning. "Thank you for everything." She smiled. "He's doing the work. I'm just here." But they both knew that wasn't true. She wasn't just there. She was the reason there was still hope in this house. She was the reason his son drew pictures with smiling suns. She was the reason Charles could breathe again. Kevin carefully added one more detail to his drawing: a small heart floating above the three figures, colored in bright red crayon. "Perfect," Helene whispered, and Kevin nodded, satisfied with his work, satisfied with this moment, satisfied in a way that 6 months ago had seemed impossible. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured grounds of his estate, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine peace. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone deserves a chance to heal. Apathetic people who don't care about others' emotional pain will skip this. To confirm you're not a coward who backs down from what's right, comment "Courage wins." Only the cowardly will remain silent.